So good afternoon to everybody, and I sincerely thank the ARC for having invited me. My talk is on pediatric perspectives. It's a big ocean, and I would like to cover as much as possible what we need to train our residents in. So I'll have to stop when the time pauses. So in summary, I have put these boxes that you need to train the residents in vision estimation, in strabismus evaluation, in pediatric cataract essentials, in pediatric refraction, red eye, and the basics of syndromes. I'll try to cover as much as possible within the time allocated to me. So estimating the visual acuity is undoubtedly the most important step in evaluation of a child, and it is the first step in strabismus evaluation. So above 5 years, most of us would be able to evaluate the visual acuity using Snellen or ETDRS charts, but for less than 5 years, it's a challenge. So in infants, you can use the teller acuity or the Lee paddles. They are interchangeable. For 1 to 3 years, you can use the Lee paddles or the Keeler cards, and for 3 to 5 years, the matching cards. I'll try to show it in the videos to come. So this is a small child. So with Lee paddles being used, and the child merely looks towards the pattern that gives an estimate of the visual acuity. The residents have to be exposed to this. And this is a matching visual acuity test. The child may not be able to indicate that this is a fish, but will be able to point it out in the key card. And this can be used for vision testing in 1 to 3 years of age. So refraction, refraction, we use atropine refraction in children who are less than 5 years old. And for above 5 years, we use cyclopentolate, tropicamide, and cyclopentolate. Homide is used whenever there is a history of seizures or in patients with neurological complaints. So now I go to strabismus evaluation and the essentials of what we need to train our residents. So we need to sensitize our residents that the first step in strabismus evaluation after visual acuity estimation and refraction is attention. You need to give the child or the patient a distance fixation target for him or her to assume the head posture. The head posture may or may not be related to strabismus or nystagmus. If you do not correct the head posture before doing a cover test, you may miss the strabismus. And in confusing cases, I'll come to that. For example, this patient was very uncooperative when we corrected her head posture. So what we did was we patched this eye first and the other eye next, and the child's head posture did not change. So we can, with a reasonable degree of certainty, assume that the child's head posture is not related to the strabismus or nystagmus or any other ocular condition for that matter. Of course, this is assuming that vision and refraction has been done, and this is what we need to sensitize our residents to. We need to tell them that the corneal reflex test gives a crude estimate of the ocular deviation, and they need to proceed with. They also need to identify these false things. For example, this patient seems to have an exotropia and a positive angle kappa. This is because of a positive angle kappa. When you do a cover test, the patient doesn't have any deviation. So it's a false strabismus. Before we go for strabismus evaluation, we need to sensitize the residents towards identifying this false strabismus. This is a patient with pseudoesotropia, and the esotropia appearance is because of the epicanthus inversus. So, of course, the cover test also showed that the child was orthophoric. So, all this we need to teach our residents, and the cover test undoubtedly is the most sensitive method to detect strabismus. We need to tell them that the prerequisites for a cover test are the presence of central fixation, good vision, and a reasonably normal range of movement in the field being tested. So we need to tell them that accommodative targets are to be used. They should not use a torchlight for cover test because accommodation needs to be standardized. And I use this diagram very often when I teach my residents and fellows. If you cover one eye, the other eye moves out, that signifies esotropia. So the use of a schematic diagram followed by a practical demonstration. For example, when you cover this eye, the right eye takes a fixation. When you remove the cover, the right eye continues to have fixation. So we need to tell our residents that this is a cover test. They should not confuse it with an alternate cover test and to identify free alternation. On the other hand, when you cover this right eye, the left eye takes a fixation, but as soon as you remove the cover, the fixation goes back. So this is a left exotropia. And the third one is an uncovered test. Whenever these patients say that they have strabismus, you're not able to pick it up. To bring out this latent strabismus, you can do what is called an uncovered test. And an alternate cover test picks up the total strabismus. So all this has to be taught, and we also need to teach our residents how to do a prism neutralization. So this is under correction, and as you gradually increase the strength of the prisms, you get a reversal. So the prism that neutralizes the deviation just before the reversal is the amount of deviation. So they also need to be taught the importance of refractive errors. For example, this child seems to have an esotropia. When you give her the plus glasses, the esotropia goes away. It appears as if the patient is straight. So this is an accommodative esotropia. So that is the importance of an accurate refraction in a patient. They also need to be taught the saccadic evaluation. For example, this patient has a sixth nerve palsy. And even without doing a force reduction testing, you can say, especially in children, you may not be able to do a force reduction testing. You can say that this patient has a right sixth nerve palsy. On the other hand, differentiated from this, where the left eye has a tethered stop. So it's because of a tight medial rectus. You can see the condition here. The medial rectus is inflamed and the tethered stop. So this difference is very important to be taught to residents. Of course, they also need to be taught the force reduction testing, how to do a topical anesthesia, because that is the key to identifying restrictive vis-a-vis paralytic strabismus. Yeah. So now we go to the nerve palsy evaluation. Dr. Rohit has covered part of it. Third nerve palsy, I just want to emphasize one thing. We need to tell them to identify intorsion of the globe when the from where the fourth nerve is also involved in a third nerve palsy. Sixth nerve evaluation. The sixth nerve evaluation. So sixth nerve palsy evaluation. So we need to tell them that duction testing is very, very important in sixth nerve palsy. So restriction of ocular motility in superior oblique palsy can be very subtle. So they need to be taught the nuances of the Parkes three-step test. So Parkes three-step test assumes that whatever deviation is there, it is because of the weakness of the elevators or the depressors. For example, the right eye is higher in this patient. So the right depressors or the left elevators are weak. And if you notice carefully, the R by L increases on left gaze. So R by L increases on left gaze. So this narrows down to right superior oblique or left superior rectus. And on the head tilt, the R by L, if you notice, increases on right tilt. So they need to be taught the mnemonic that superior same side. So we finally narrow down the diagnosis to right superior oblique palsy. So we need to remember that the Parkes three-step test has many fallacies and has been challenged by many authors, but it nevertheless remains a useful part of the PG teaching program. And cataracts in children. So I'll just take one more minute and I'll wind up. So cataracts come in a variety of morphologies. For example, this is a lamellar cataract, and this is a lamella with sutural cataract, and this is a total cataract. And this is a microspherophakia. This very carefully they need to look. Anterior lenticonus, and this is an ectopia lentis. Anterior lenticonus is very important to identify. So the difference is that in pediatric cataracts they have an elastic anterior capsule and low scleral rigidity, and they need to be done under GA. And this is how you assess the visual significance. The vision is less than 612, or if it is more than 3 millimeter, or if the child is complaining, then it's visually significant. All this needs to be taught. So I'll just wind up with a surgery video. So this is the ideal age of cataract surgery, which also we need to teach them. And this is the procedure that we do age-wise. And I shall wind up with a short video on surgery, because I have many more slides, but I don't think we have the time to go through all this. So I prefer doing a scleral tunnel incision, but not everybody agrees with that. So the key to doing is achieving successful rhexis is aim for a smaller rhexis, frequent injections of viscoelastics, frequent regrasping, and pull towards the center of 180 degree away. And yeah, that having been done, the cataract is very soft, easily comes out with an IA probe. And the choice of lens is a hydrophobic acrylic in these patients. Choice of lens is a hydrophobic acrylic. And we need to do a PPC in young children, and anti-vitrectomy and the IOL implantation. So I'll just wind up here and stop sharing because my time is up. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muralidhar sir. And that was an excellent presentation. Dr. Sushmita Kaushik ma'am, very good afternoon to you and very warm welcome to you. And also a very warm welcome to Dr. Akshay Nair, who is our part of our expert panel. Dr. Sushmita ma'am, I would like you to comment on Dr. Muralidhar sir's talk, and what is your take on the exposure of pediatric ophthalmology training in our residents today?
So mercifully, all specialities have their children. So at least in most comprehensive practices, they get to see a lot of children and what to do with them, even though it may not be in all residencies a completely separate pediatric ophthalmology specialty, so to speak. But you know, the basic concepts, if all of us reiterate that we're in the business of vision. And that's one of my favorite takes. And if we understand that, then you will go on to do amblyopia management, you will go on to look at motility, you will go on to do everything else that you need to do to see to make a child see. So I think mostly nowadays there are sufficiently, if at all, we need to emphasize it's this, that our job doesn't finish with the retina being attached or the pressure being normal or the visual axis being clear, because children are not small adults and they need much more in a developing eye. But
And
the opportunities are there because we don't need too much, thankfully. We need compassion and we need to care, but we don't need too much in terms, unlike refractive surgery, let me say. So we don't need much to do.
one specific question, ma'am.
Yeah.
Suppose we think of pediatric cataract. So you
Okay.
have on one side a cataract surgeon who is, specializing in cataract surgery and has a huge experience in cataract surgery, vis-a-vis a pediatric ophthalmologist. So what is your choice? Who would you think would do more justice?
So a pediatric ophthalmologist, I think, worldwide usually does pediatric cataract, squint, strabismus, and maybe ROP screening. But they don't do the glaucoma and retina surgical part, which is understandable. If you ask me, the ideal situation would be to get the cataract surgery to do just the cataract and
Exactly.
send over to the pediatric ophthalmologist to get the vision in place.
For the amblyopia management.
Yeah, for the thing.
That was
But
my thought
simply
too.
simply because of the sheer number of and the
Right.
ease. But of course, thankfully, a pediatric cataract is soft and doesn't need too much in terms of technique. So it's not as exacting as maybe